Well, here's something interesting. The team with the worst record in the NBA, tied for the highest odds of getting the number one pick, actually got it. This is the Washington Wizards broke a streak of 3 straight years of the worst team dropping all the way to fifth in the NBA draft. This is the NBA is in the process of creating new rules around the draft lottery that to stifle teams tanking to get the number one pick. Front office sports reporter and elated Wizards fan Colin Salao joins us right now. Colin, first off, congratulations. I know you and Wizards Nation very excited about this, but you were actually at the NBA draft lottery yesterday. Before we get into the Wizards getting the number one pick, give us a little behind the scenes of what it was like there and sort of what was happening before the Wizards got the number one choice here.
Yeah, Baker, big times for Wizards Nation. But in terms of being at the draft lottery, it is here in Chicago. It took place at Navy Pier, one of the tourist spots here in Chicago. Basically, the lottery started at 2 p.m. Central Time, but at about 12:45 Central Time, they called in 16 media members, generally the more national media members like Zach Lowe and Ryan Rosillo. We also had some local media folks from the Grizzlies and like the Indianapolis Star. They were part of the group of media members who went inside the actual lottery room where they picked out the balls alongside top execs, one exec each representing the 14 teams that were there for the lottery. Now, the rest of the media members at about 1:30 Central were called into the room alongside about 13 or so prospects in the 2026 draft, including AJ Dybantsa and Darren Peterson and Cameron Boozer. They were all in attendance. You kind of felt like, the usual people are mingling over, for the next 30 minutes before it starts. And then when it starts, it gets pretty quiet and pretty tense in the room. My favorite part was when they started reading the 14 names and Oklahoma City, which had a 7.1% chance of moving into the top four, was drawn as number 12. And you could kind of hear, that was the first time that night that I could hear, or that afternoon that I could hear some folks, breathe a little bit that like, okay, the defending champions who are probably are considered to win again are not going to move up into the top four. You heard a little bit of sounds when the Warriors at 11 stayed put. And then, of course, the four teams that moved up were announced. Ultimately, it was not so drastic because there wasn't like a massive move up like the Mavericks last year. But, I would describe the atmosphere as very tense and then obviously jovial for the Washington Wizards and even for the Chicago Bulls, who moved the biggest from 9 to 4.
Yeah, the Bulls obviously were the biggest surprise. And, you mentioned the Mavericks getting their number one pick last year at 1.8%. Obviously there's a huge sigh of relief because the teams that had even better odds than that, Golden State and even Milwaukee, they got like 10th and 11th. So it obviously showed the worst teams were getting the better chances here to get the pick. So let's stick with Washington here for a moment because now they get the number one selection and they're adding to the roster that already includes Anthony Davis and Trae Young. Is this a sign here, Colin, I guess, that tanking, given the fact that they had a 14% chance, the largest of all the teams, worked?
Yes. I think outright, yes. In fact, Michael Winger, the president of the Washington Wizards, after the draft, he spoke in a scrum with reporters, and I was part of that scrum. And he essentially said that this was, a reward, or it was very rewarding to see that the work they've put in over the last few years has gotten to this point. Now, Wizards fans and folks alike will tell you that, yeah, the team has done a lot internally to change this, the organization and the way that it's run and the moves that they've been made. But of course, one of the things that they did was to blatantly tank this year. And so for him to say that it's rewarding, that it's a reward, that's part of what they did. So I think that it definitely shows that, tanking in this instance works. The question, though, is not really whether it works under this system, because I think that even though we've seen teams not always get the number one pick, you could still make the case that like a Detroit, for example, were often at the bottom of the standings, and eventually it paid off for them. Even Oklahoma City with getting Chet Holmgren, it eventually paid off for them to, tank for a few years. I think the broader question is, is this the last year of tanking? And the NBA hopes that it is.
Yeah, we'll get to that in just a second. I mean, obviously, you had some of the worst teams getting the top three selections, given the fact that this is such a top-heavy draft of the three guys, specifically Dybantsa and Peterson and Boozer, who are going to likely go the top three picks right there. But then you have Sacramento, who also had a terrible record getting the seventh pick. So it sort of shows sort of the dichotomy between all of this. To the Wizards, really quickly though. There has been some reports online that maybe the Wizards could trade down. Maybe they don't keep the number one pick. I don't know if you've seen some of these reports, but how much of a slam dunk is it that they do keep that first pick and they do select Dybantsa here?
Yeah, I have seen reports of that. I feel like if I were to look back into the past and one team, and I'll actually look at the NFL, where the Bears had the number one pick a few years ago. They ended up trading the number one pick to Carolina to get. Uh, they thought they might keep trade the pick. There's a lot of be unsure if the Bears were going to keep the pick, trade the pick, and then the year later they got the number one pick again, and then they traded. They ended up not trading the pick and selecting Caleb Williams, and eventually trading Justin Fields. I bring that up because I wouldn't be surprised if the Wizards are just saying these things to explore their options, to keep their options open, to see what could be, what they could assume to get or possibly get with having the number one pick, especially because it's been no secret that the Utah Jazz really, really value or would love to have AJ Dybantsa, the BYU kid who's been there for years. So I wouldn't be surprised if they're just looking to at least, show us your hand. Is someone willing to offer 130 cents on the dollar for AJ Dybantsa? But ultimately, I think the Wizards are going to decide to keep that pick. I think it's too hard, and that's going to be such a GM defining move if you don't if you trade that pick, and you don't want to be the GM that trades Luka Doncic for Trae Young. Ironically, Trae Young is now in Washington D.C.
By the way, here's an interesting stat for you. The Wizards now are the third team to be involved in an Anthony Davis trade to end up getting the number one pick. The Pelicans in 2019 and the Mavericks in 2024 also were in that. Is it for sure going to be Dybantsa? Whoever, if it's the Wizards or whomever, is Dybantsa, though, going to be the number one pick?
I think the prevailing theme right now, or the prevailing thought right now, is that it would be AJ Dybantsa in large part because of what happened to Darren Peterson, and how he was a little controversial way he took part, or his college season went. But I wouldn't be surprised if a team works Darren Peterson out and sees the Kobe Bryant-esque comparisons that you've been hearing, and says, "Hey, this guy is going to be an elite offensive player. He's going to be the engine of our offense for so long." And maybe another team says that that same team says that they don't want to risk Dybantsa's, maybe his jump shot. They don't trust it. And in a league that's moved to, 3-point shooting values 3-point shooting as a premium, maybe they go Darren Peterson. So I don't think it's as much of a slam dunk as Victor Wembanyama was, even Anthony Davis was, as you mentioned, back in 2012. But I would be very surprised still if AJ Dybantsa isn't selected number one when we come to the NBA draft in June.
All right, so the Wizards obviously a big winner in all of this. Another team, honestly, I feel like is a big winner in this are the Pelicans because of the trade with Derek Queen last year giving up their unprotected first-round pick, which went to the Hawks. The theory was maybe the Hawks could end up getting the lottery pick. They didn't. They ended up getting number 9. So that turns out to be a big win for the Pelicans. Another team that seems to be the big winner in this is the Clippers on behalf of the Pacers, because the Pacers had a 14% chance, like the Wizards, to get the number 1 selection, but they only kept the pick if it landed in the top 4 because of the Zubac trade that happened at the trade deadline. Instead, they got the 5th pick, which then goes to the Clippers. So how big of a loss is this for the Pacers? Because clearly you have the president of the Pacers, Kevin Pritchard, already apologizing to fans about the trade already.
It's massive. It was going to be a franchise-altering pick if they got a top 4 selection, not just for the short term and for a team that is competing for a championship as early as next season, but for the long term, for the future of this team, where Tyrese Halliburton is still about to enter his prime and Pascal Siakam is sort of exiting that prime. You if you got the number one pick, AJ Dybantsa would fit right in as kind of transitioning you from a Pascal Siakam as your second guy to an AJ Dybantsa or a Cam Boozer or a Darren Peterson or even a Caleb Wilson at number 4. And instead, you're getting nothing. You have a season where you win 19 games and you come out of it getting essentially nothing. Now, Kevin Pritchard will argue that Ivica Zubac is that reward, and Ivica Zubac is a great player, a starting caliber, borderline all-star caliber center. But when you suffer for so long, the way that the Pacers did, that is a brutal, brutal loss, and something that, while the team is still going to likely be very good next year, and for at least the short-term future, it is a big sliding doors moment for the NBA because the Clippers now will have the 5th pick, now can improve on their roster amid everything that they're going through in this, whatever happens, whatever punishment they will likely receive under this salary cap circumvention accusations or allegations. It's nice to know that you have a top 5 pick coming out of it.
Yeah, especially because you're looking for what's going to happen after Kawhi Leonard, and 90%, I feel like, of the Clippers roster is a free agent after next season. So for once, the Clippers are sort of building for the future here. We've sort of hinted at the format changing a lot. So let's really dive into that next, because look, for all intents and purposes, if you wanted to tank this year and you were a team like Utah and Washington, it worked out in your favor. But now it seems like the whole entire format will change. So how do you sort of think this all ends up next year? And let's talk about the potential scenarios of what the draft lottery will look like.
Yeah, so the big one that's been floated over the last couple of weeks is this 3-2-1 lottery format, which basically adds 2 extra teams, goes from 14 to 16 in terms of the lottery teams, and then as well kind of adds this relegation zone where if you're one of the 3 worst teams in the league, you essentially have worse odds than if you were the 4th worst team in the league. There's been a lot of pushback in terms of the fact that it's such a complicated structure. My answer to that is that a lot of the people who are making the decisions behind the scenes are very smart people who love their math and love their numbers and understand that it's as complicated as it is. To them, it's not. The lottery system to me feels like something that's not, it's not really meant for fans to care about the actual system, as much as that kind of sucks. I know that fans would love it. I think that the NBA is looking at it as kind of a format that's like, we need the teams to not tank. We don't really care if the fans don't understand the lottery system, because ultimately this is about the broader health of the league. I do think there is a big chance that tanking kind of maybe not stops completely, but stalls out a lot more under this new system, because it really does kind of put the same equal odds for majority of the teams. So being maybe like a 9th, 10th worst team is almost the same as being, the 3rd worst or the 4th worst team. So why do I need to tank? Why don't I just potentially chase a play in? I think the part that's a little complicated here, though, as some people have said, is what if they make the play in and realize that I'd rather just have better odds in the lottery? So that's the part that there might be some fishiness there, because maybe a team like, let's say, Golden State was like, okay, let me just lose the play in purposely. And if we see a scenario like that, I do believe there's a chance that we're going to have potentially more lottery reform again in the future. But it is a little bit of a case by case basis. And just as we've seen, depending on how the lottery goes, it depends on what the draft class looks like, who are the teams at the bottom. That really that determines a lot of whether teams tank or not every year. So I don't know if I'm necessarily in favor of the 3-2-1 lottery system, but I do understand its purpose. And I do think that there's going to be significantly less tanking under that format, if it is the one that they decide to vote on.
Right, because in theory, you could still be, playing for a play-in game, potentially even making the play-in game, and still have good chances to get the number 1 pick. I guess, the skeptics would then come back and say, isn't the purpose of the draft to make the worst teams better, the teams that don't have, all the stars that all the better teams do? The NFL is the only league that doesn't have a lottery, and nobody ever complains that the worst team is always getting the number one selection. So I guess the question I have is do we even need a lottery? Should the worst teams be getting the best odds to get these picks?
I think it's a really good question because I think it's kind of like a chicken and an egg scenario, right? It's like it should tanking is very very bad. It's an epidemic in the league. But then if we decide to go to the scenario of removing the lottery and making the worst team get it, then now you're going to have the most egregious tanking that there possibly is.
Because what happens if Oklahoma City got it,
So to that point, it's like, well, which do you fix? It might be a difficult scenario. And I will actually go and say, if you take a step back, the reason why it's not a huge problem in the NFL is because there are only 17 games in the NFL. So you can only tank for, 2, 3, 4 games. Whereas in the NBA, you have an 82 game schedule. Teams are tanking by game 40. Teams are tanking by game 1 in some scenarios. Whereas if you're looking at if you had a shorter season potentially, then maybe you don't have that much leeway, or there are not going to be that many teams that are doing, that are egregiously tanking, or there's just going to be less games that teams are going to be egregiously tanking. So, I think it's really like a chicken and egg scenario because you're only going to be able to solve one problem. And if you pull the lever for one, it's going to push back the other. I think the NBA now is like overcorrecting and saying, well, we need to just make sure tanking is gone and we'll solve the rest of the problems. If we start seeing that like a team XYZ, if, for example, not the Wizards now, like the Brooklyn Nets, for example, are just stuck in limbo and for 5 years in a row get the 7th pick in the draft or the 6th pick in the draft and can't get anything from it, then maybe that's where we see more changes. But right now, I think they're pulling the lever one way in large part because the tanking has just gotten to a point that's just too egregious.
Well, this gets to a question about conspiracy theorists, because obviously I mentioned Oklahoma City because they have a bajillion first round picks over the next 5 years or so. So there was obviously worry maybe they would get a lottery pick. But look, last year, because of the Luka Doncic trade, and the Dallas Mavericks having a 1.8% chance to get the number one pick, getting Cooper Flag, do you think because there wasn't anything what seems nefarious here, the fact that the worst teams did end up getting the number one, the early picks here, do you think that quiets any sort of talk of conspiracies here?
I think that depending on the results of every lottery, there's going to be more or less conspiracy talk. We're a society that bases a lot of its beliefs on results. But if Oklahoma City did jump up in what is a numbers-based, math-based system, people would start pointing at conspiracy theories. I'm kind of in the middle with, if there were conspiracy theories, sure. Like, I kind of understand why people would think that. But at the same time, I'm also at the point where, like, hey, the math really does make it so that like this stuff can happen, crazy stuff can happen. But I also think you can create a conspiracy theory out of anything, right? Like, yes, people are going to say, hey, there's no conspiracy theory this year because the Mavs didn't jump up or the Warriors didn't jump up or the Thunder didn't jump up. But then you could also say that, hey, the NBA is trying to make it seem like, getting the worst record actually got you the top picks. So now we're going to fix tanking completely. And now we're really egregiously fixing tanking because the worst teams got the top picks. Look at us solve this problem that showed in this year's draft. So I think there's a way every year, if you want to tweak your mind to make it look like there's a conspiracy theory, when in totality, and if you ask the folks probably inside those rooms, it's pretty tough and pretty ironclad that this is just lottery balls being picked out. But I also don't hate the folks who are thinking conspiracy theory.
No, because that gives us something to talk about, right?
It's also just fun, and it's also just like the coincidences are just too much, right? With some of these draft picks.
Yeah. Last question. The Bulls, obviously, you're in Chicago. you know, the Bulls, I think, have the most amount of cap. I think of like $60 million in cap that they can play with. They got multiple, I think, four draft picks this next year. Is there excitement around the Bulls in the offseason?
Goodness, there is a wild amount of excitement. I walked back into my apartment building last night, and the doorman was like screaming because he knows that I'm like a Bulls guy or like an NBA guy, and he's just like screaming
Yeah.
like, "We got the fourth pick." Um, it You could see the smile on new GM Bryson Graham's face yesterday at the draft. He was saying that he was very excited. Um, it's There is definitely like a buzz with Chicago because of how much misery they've suffered the last couple of years. Like I am a Wizards, I follow the Wizards. I root for the Wizards, but you can make a case over the last year or so that I'd rather be a Wizards guy than a Bulls guy because at least there was a direction
Mhm.
that they were following. And now to have the fourth pick, granted, the last fourth pick that the Bulls got was not necessarily great. Cough, cough, Patrick Williams, but it's still a lot of excitement in a draft where it's very hard to miss someone in the top four. So to kickstart what is supposed to be a rebuild right now in Chicago with a blue chip prospect, you can definitely feel the buzz here. And even inside, there was a little bit of hype because there's a lot more Chicago-based reporters in at the draft lottery. You could tell that the scrum around Bryson Graham was a little bit bigger than the scrum around other players. There was clearly more hype yesterday, knowing that the Bulls moved up, the biggest movers in the draft lottery.
Yeah, the huge news if you're a Bulls fan. The draft taking place on June the 23rd and 24th. Colin Salao, thank you so much for telling us all the scoop of what happened yesterday. Thank you.
Of course, we'll talk about it soon. Wizards, baby.
Yes, yes, we will. Yes, we will. Good to be a Wizards fan today. And stay with Front Office Sports for more on the business and culture of sports.